Right, while you're organising yourselves, I will crack on with the session. So organise yourselves quietly, please, so we can do this properly. We've only got an hour to discuss what I think is a hugely impressive and important topic. Well, this is it. The 2022 or NATO 22 Strategic Concept. And my congratulations to Benedetta and her team, to Baiba, for what I think is actually a very, very impressive document. We'll get into the realisation of this document as part of our discussion. But this is NATO's future, and that is what we're here to discuss. And I'm honoured to have three friends on the panel to discuss this. Our first speaker will be Benedetta Berti, who is Head of Policy Planning in the Office of the Secretary General of NATO. Our second speaker will be Baiba Braže, Assistant Secretary General of NATO Public Diplomacy. And our third speaker will be Eivind Vad Petersson, who is State Secretary to the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs. They will all have 5 minutes, and I'm a stern chair, no more than 5 minutes, before I open the floor to you all and some social media stuff, which old men like me find challenging, but I'll try. If you want to ask questions from the floor, there are two mics. One to my right, one to my left over here, so you'll have to make your way down to these microphones, and if I have the time, I will recognise you. Before we get started, let me just try to frame the debate we're about to enter into. I think the NATO Strategic Concept is perhaps the most well-drafted, dare I say it, since the 1967 Strategic Concept. And I'm a historian of strategic concepts, Benedetta, so I can tell you I enjoyed it very much. And more importantly, it complements the military strategy and much of the vaguely classified material, which all of us have read, but we're not meant to, which I sometimes wonder why we don't simply publish, because that itself would be an act of deterrence, which is, after all, the core business of NATO. Deterrence and defence going forward. The challenge for our respective nations, and particularly for my nation, which seems to have a Prime Minister a week these days, but we won't go... I believe I'm scheduled to be Prime Minister March 2025. But we'll see where this ends up. It's still a wish list, and this will still have to be paid for. And the next 10 to 15 years will see a revolution in military technology. And I know that's an overused word, revolution, but I'm convinced, having just written an absolutely brilliant and very reasonably priced book on this subject, that artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, all this new technology, emerging and disruptive technologies, will have a very significant impact, not just on how we do deterrence and defence, but also how we operate together, particularly with our American allies. So I think there's a whole range of implicit challenges which the strategic concept does indeed begin to grip. Now, Benedetta joined me a couple of weeks ago at a conference that I had the honour to lead, called the Future War and Deterrence Conference at Wilton Park, a kind of stately home in the middle of the English nowhere, in which we looked at all these issues. The report will come out next week, and it's clear that the NATO force model and all that goes with it, and all the adaptation stroke transformation of the alliance going out to 2030 will require not countries, nations, not only to invest, but to invest cleverly and to invest with each other. And the NATO defence planning process becomes clearly more important than ever if we are to generate effective and efficient defence that is clearly value for money, which is what the alliance is there to achieve. Now, my panel have two specific questions that I've asked them to address. The first question is thus: what challenges, capabilities and values should NATO's strategic concept be guided by? My second is, how do we balance the ends, ways and means to realise the necessary strategic ambition in the strategic concept. I agree with the Secretary General. The 2% defence investment pledge, 20% on new equipment per annum, agreed many years ago, is now a baseline, not a ceiling. This is going to cost. So how, given all the other pressures that we are now facing, are we going to afford the capabilities, the capacities implicit in this strategic concept? So without further ado, 5 minutes, Benedetta, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Julian, for the kind introduction, for framing the debate, and also for saying that you think the strategic concept is very well drafted. I absolutely agree, and that's not because I drafted it. No, sorry. I will not use my 5 minutes unwisely, so I'll go right into the matter. I think the question you wanted me to address is what is the vision and the strategic concept? What are the main threats, challenges, capabilities? In other words, what is it all about? I think a good way to start is to start by saying what this document is supposed to do. Because I think the title of the panel is Vision or Plan, what is it? Well, I'm not sure that I would like to frame it that way. I would say the strategic concept is the second most important document for NATO after the North Atlantic Treaty, which is, of course, the foundations treaty for NATO. And it is a one-stop shop, if you wish, the expression of a light grand strategy. So it sets the long-term vision, the long-term goals, it sets the strategic direction for the alliance. It is by itself not a plan. The plan is the follow-up. The plan is what we're doing now. We are operationalizing it through new policies. We're operationalizing it in political military advice that will then inform the NDPP, the NATO defense planning process. It will be translated into military plans. So it has a trickle-down effect and then goes into shaping the way the alliance operates. In terms of what the strategic concept is about, when I think about what is the 1-minute explanation, to me, this is the first post-Cold War concept. We had our 4 secret military Cold War concepts focused on one threat, one theater, deterrence and defense against the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended, our mindset shift. We have 3 post-Cold War concepts, framing security as a very broad subject, talking about the the Euro-Atlantic area peace, talking about risk of conflict being low, giving us the perception that the threats and challenges will come from without, the area of responsibility, and we'll have to invest in crisis management at strategic distance. Very different word. This, I think, the 2022 strategic concept is de facto a testament that peace dividend decades are over. Those peace dividend decades are over. Geopolitics is back, real politics is back, and we're talking about the Euro-Atlantic area not being at peace. We're talking about a security environment that is only likely to be more complex, more contested, more volatile, and more unpredictable. And he really talks about, if I had to give you 2 words, I would say strategic competition. How do we prepare for an era of strategic competition in which we have Russia as the most direct and significant threat to our security and to Euro-Atlantic peace and stability. But we also have a broader challenge to the rules-based international order. We have assertive authoritarian powers pushing back against that order, promoting authoritarian models of governance, and testing and challenging us using all means and all tools in their toolbox. So we need to start thinking about these instruments of power in an interrelated way, from military to economic coercion and from disinformation to energy blackmail. It's all part of a spectrum. So I think the strategic concept tries to capture this reality, and this is why this is the first NATO strategy that talks about China. I think very, very important. Talks about the PRC's stated objectives and coercive policies as posing challenges to our security, to our values, and to our interests, and talks about the need to address them together as a transatlantic community. This is a very important step forward. So to me, that's the general theme, how to prepare for an era in which we have to be better at responding to what we could call persistent competition or contestation, both above and below the threshold. So if that's our end, and I'm not going to talk so much about the ends, ways, and means, because I know that's the next question, but if that's their strategic end, it's clear that we need to to be very focused in how we think about NATO's mission. And I think that's what the strategic concept tries to do, while recognizing that this is not a Cold War. We don't have the luxury to focus just on one threat,
1 minute, please.
one theater. And that's why we focus on collective defense, but declined in a very broad way. So there is, of course, the need to strengthen our deterrence and defense, and I'm sure we'll talk about more in the Q&A, but this is framed in a broader approach, multi-domain, and underpinned by a strong call to have a real collective approach to resilience, meaning not just infrastructure, but also recognizing, mitigating, and addressing strategic vulnerabilities at all levels. So it's so that's a tall order, but I think it's essential for our deterrence and defense. And finally, in my last 20 seconds, all of this is grounded in a global approach, because we recognize that we deal with a lot of threats and challenges, from cyber to hybrid, from climate change to terrorism, that know no borders. Therefore, we cannot be limited to thinking only and solely in terms of geographical domains, and that's why we have this important call to work with partners. And last point, that's why this is the first time that a NATO strategy directly refers to the connections between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic, and mentions that actually security developments in the Indo-Pacific can affect us here at home. So the transatlantic community is one theater. I'll stop here.
Benedetta, thank you very much. Very clear. I love the peace dividend decades are over, and we are back in an age of geopolitics. Baiba, public diplomacy and strategic communications are very much the method of the strategic concept. Ultimately, strategic concepts are strategic communications, reaching out not just to a NATO audience, but to audiences across the world. So from your perspective, how does the strategic concept communicate with the world which NATO must engage?
Thank you for the question. And for NATO, actually, it's an instrument of power. So when we talk about the instruments of power, the information, so strategic communications is the only instrument of power that is across both civilian and military domains. So in that respect, it's indeed very important what we tell our populations, what we tell our adversaries, and what we tell to those partners who want to join NATO, and to those countries that are further away but are like-minded, but also to the rest of the world. And the strategic concept that is not classified, that is well written, that is very clear, very straightforward, is an important tool in that respect. It has to be, of course, implemented not only for reassurance purposes to our populations, so they have to see that NATO is there to deter and defend if necessary, but also our adversaries have to be very clear that NATO is there to defend every inch of the Allied territory. And in this respect, I think it's very important that the strategic concept also presents the vision. It clearly says that we want to live in the world where the rules of territorial integrity, the human rights, the freedoms are respected, and where countries can choose their own path, free from aggression, coercion, or anything else. So in that respect, there is a vision that allies say that we will stand for that vision. We will defend these freedoms. And then when we look at the ways and means, of course, that is as important. And that's, again, it's in the strategic concept, in the military strategy, in the next decisions that we will have to take. So looking at the ways, again, we have to refer back to the fact that the strategic concept does define Russia as the most direct threat to Allied security and to the peace in the Euro-Atlantic area, and terrorism as the main asymmetric threat. So from there on, both our civilian and military authorities have worked out very particular ways, which is in-place presence. We all know that the summit decided to strengthen forward presence from the battalion to the brigade level. It prescribes, of course, the enhanced defense plans, integrated robust command structure, so improved C2, the readiness, the logistics, the infrastructure, prepositioning, and exercises. The new type of exercises, multi-domain, reinforcement exercise is very clear, meant to show what the strategic concept and what the military strategy is. So all that comes, of course, down to means. So allies are discussing what does it require, how do we ensure the supply, how do we ensure production, how do we ensure that the defense industry gets the signals that the needs are there for not just today or tomorrow or half a year, but for the long term. We are discussing the needs for the defense spending, where, as Julian said, 2% is not a ceiling but a floor. What for this is going to be spent? And then, of course, very clearly, again, we have to remember that this is all about our values. This is what we stand for, that it's not just because currently this situation requires it, but the very fact that the rules-based international orders that countries in the world, 193 members of the UN have signed up to, actually matter. And what we see in Ukraine, that Ukraine is standing up for the UN Charter with arms. They are self-defending in accordance with the UN Charter, and it's actually that is what matters, and that is that line that we have to keep in mind.
Thank you, Baiba. Ultimately, the ultimate instrument of power is NATO itself, is our alliance. It's an instrument of power. And Eivind, at the end of the day, the nations have to pay for it. They're the ones who are the paymasters. And reading the language of the strategic concept, we're not only going to have to develop a new force model, but resilience is also going to have to be significantly enhanced to reduce the vulnerabilities of our societies, of critical infrastructures and communications, before we can be credible in deterrence and defence mission, or indeed the full spectrum of missions that the alliance, to which the alliance is committed. Give us a sense of the Norwegian perspective on the strategic concept and where you see it taking us over the next decade.
No, I'd love to. Thank you, Julian, for that. Let me, allow me to maybe two quick steps back. Just to,
sure.
Say that I came of age, politically at least, in the 1990s, when and I remember very well that the heading for the NATO debate was back then out of area or out of business. Then came the early 2000s, where at least from the Norwegian side, we were increasingly worried that an entire generation of NATO officers, especially in our armies, were more familiar with the valleys and mountains of Afghanistan than European North Atlantic terrain coast. That now is in the past. NATO is back in area and back in business, and that is good. And let me also share with you briefly on the national side. In Norway, we're happy to report North Korea numbers in terms of support for NATO membership. 96% of Norwegians are in favor of Norway being a member of NATO.
It's like referendums in some of the...
Yeah, so the Secretary General, I know he was happy with that number as well. My perspective is, of course, from a national government of an ally, so somewhat different. But then, in general, I think all allies are now facing the same challenge. On the one hand, worsening of the security situation due to Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. And on the other hand, let's be honest, limited fiscal room for maneuver in budgets due to the need to combat inflation. Let there be no doubt that Norway and then our government is prioritizing security and defense. Recently proposed a national budget for next year. Defense budget 7.6 billion euros, year-on-year increase of almost 8%, roughly €500 million, also adjusted for inflation. Because burden sharing is indeed important for allied cohesion and solidarity. Over the last decade, European allies and Canada have made progress. We, as Norway, during the pandemic, were above the 2% ceiling target, whatever we now choose to call it. Unfortunately, right now, we are below again, but our commitment, of course, stands. And when it comes to investments, we are now roughly at 30% of our defense budget, well above the 20% target. But for NATO to really be able to operationalize the strategic concept, I'd like to mention that increased common funding also is essential. Common funding is the glue that binds the alliance together. One example in the new strategic concept, there are concrete ambitions for NATO's digital transformation. NATO needs robust digital networks, key for resilience, of course. And in addition, there's colleagues in the panel, of course, have other affiliations to NATO, but I'm happy to say this from a member state. NATO's command structure and the NATO international staff have long been understaffed. The NATO headquarters staffing today is at the same level as in 1990, when NATO had 12 members. Soon we are 32. And the agreement reached at the Madrid summit about an increase in common funding was very welcome, but it needs implementation each budget year, and as always, the proof is in the pudding. The Madrid Strategic Concept, we believe, confirmed NATO's intention to significantly strengthen the alliance deterrence and defense posture. Counting words is not the most sophisticated way of analyzing things. Nonetheless, deterrence in the 2010 concept was mentioned 4 times. In the recent 2022 concept, deterrence is mentioned 22 times. An indication, nonetheless. Overall, it is our view that NATO has been able to adapt well to the unprecedented situation in Ukraine. Collective defense has been bolstered. We've gone from 4 to 8 multinational battle groups on the eastern flank. Allied presence, including here in Latvia, has been considerably strengthened. And Norway, for our part, we have increased our presence in Lithuania as part of the enhanced forward presence. From a Norwegian standpoint, we are pleased that the strategic concept highlights the importance of the High North and the maritime domain. The Russian ability to disrupt Allied reinforcements across the North Atlantic remains a strategic challenge to European allies beyond just ourselves in the Nordic region. And it has critical implications for Allied security in crisis and conflict, and something we need to address.
1 more minute, please, Eivind.
In Madrid, of course, Finland and Sweden were invited to become members. Excellent news, very important for Nordic, Baltic, Nordic and European security. We've removed grey zones and increased predictability. Let me finish on my introductory remarks with a few words on risk management on vis-a-vis Russia. We believe that needs to be part of our approach as well. We have to avoid misunderstandings and unintended escalation. In Ukraine, Russia has demonstrated that it's weaker conventionally than we expected, but President Putin's willingness to take risks is of concern. The strategic concept underscores the importance of maintaining military hotlines with Russia. This is prudent in today's situation. We believe SACEUR has a communication channel with his Russian counterpart. The Norwegian joint headquarters, and they maintain a hotline with the headquarters of the Russian Northern Fleet. These hotlines are all the more important because most of the confidence and security building measures and arms control architecture in Europe is gone. Therefore, increased relevance also to maintain stability in what is actually in at least recent memory and unprecedented security situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eivind. Spot on time, and thank you to all three for very clear, succinct and good opening statements. The floor is now open, so if you want to make your way down to respective microphones, is there one there? I can't see it, but there's certainly one over there. Sir, the floor is yours. Questions should be short, succinct, and no counter speeches, please.
Absolutely.
Big question.
Thank you,
Yeah, a question.
Dr. Lindley-French, for the opportunity. My question is...
Who are you, sir, first?
Sure, sorry. J.J. Green, WTOP Radio, Washington, D.C., National Security Correspondent. My question is for Ms. Baiba Braže. A little more than a year ago, I had the honor of being on a panel discussion with you at another security conference. And this was shortly after the debacle in Afghanistan, to say the least, where the U.S. was heavily criticized and its commitment and actions towards NATO were questioned. So the question that I want to ask is, a little more than a year has passed. We now have a new challenge for NATO, and that is in Ukraine and some other things that are going on as well. So I'd like to ask, has this change, have the concerns been addressed? And I guess a broader question, if it's better, what's changed in that year and a little bit more than a year since we talked about this situation with NATO, the US, and its members? Thank you.
Thank you, JJ. Baiba, an easy question to begin with.
All right. We can go one by one question, or if there are more questions.
No, I'll take this question first. And then we'll,
okay. The Afghanistan, I think, didn't start and end last August. It started in 2001. And during all that time, when the international community was involved in Afghanistan, it was not just NATO. It was the whole international community doing a really good job in making sure that there are no terrorist attacks coming from the soil of that country. The fact of closing of NATO's operation and the rest of it as we know it was not the way we would have wanted, but in the same time we did our best. And the fact that allies were able to take out so many Afghans who had worked with the countries, with us, and the way the military might was shown, no other alliance would have been able to show that. It was really also that extraction operation was very much the show of strength and commitment to those Afghans who had worked with us. And it's not finished. We are still doing that behind the scenes, so it's there. And there's international pressure on Taliban to make sure that they stand up to what they said they would do. And it's not ideal either. Coming back to today, and what we are about, there is the war in Euro-Atlantic space. And that's what we are doing to make sure that the allies, currently 30 allies, soon to be 32 allies, are at peace, defended, that the adversaries are deterred, and that we prepare for the adaptation for the future to be able to deter against all threats. That is what we are doing, and that is what the mission of the alliance is.
Thank you, Baiba.
Julian,
do you want to make comments, Benedetta?
Yeah, very quickly, and just to add, of course, to agree with Baiba's comments, but also to say something perhaps unpopular, but at least from my point of view, and that is that we were faced with a number of bad options on Afghanistan, that we know. But I think in terms of NATO's core mission and mandate, that was the right choice for us. And I think 2014 for us was the wake-up call after Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, that we had to shift back our focus to collective defense. We had to shift back our focus to doing territorial defense of the Euro-Atlantic space. And that's what we started doing since 2014. And I think that even though there are many things that were far from ideal, overall, when I look at the broad strategic picture, we are where we should be now, which is now here defending our own territory.
Many things were far from ideal. As someone who wrote 3 reports for operational commanders in Afghanistan, I think the problem was campaign design and campaign implementation. I think the extraction at the end of it was making the best of a, shall we say, a very difficult situation. But I take the point. I'm going to ask for this gentleman's question and then take one from the social media. Sir, and then this gentleman.
Shota Guineria, Baltic Defense College. So the objective of NATO's deterrence was always to deter somebody from attacking NATO member states, right? There is nothing new in it. But the severe security crisis in the Euro-Atlantic area landed from outside the NATO Article 5 coverage. And now the European security paradigm is effectively destroyed. So what should be the organizing principle in the future to make sure that actually this kind of security crisis does not happen again, either or not the countries are members of NATO, and how do we protect these countries outside the NATO themselves and the whole Euro-Atlantic area? Thank you.
That's a great question. What I'm going to do, because they are similar to 2 questions I can read online with my aging eyes. What are the next big tests and challenges for NATO? And from hybrid to energy security, is there fear of NATO encroaching on new areas, can that weaken NATO? So it's all part of that, that big architectural challenge. Eivind, what's your take on this?
But coming back to the gentleman's question, looking at NATO, of course, you can argue that had Ukraine been a member, this would never have happened. However, there was not consensus among the allies to make that step. Now we are doing as much as we can to make sure that they are able to defend themselves, but they are also making progress. I think my reflection, however, on what should the future setup look like in Europe is, although the open door policy is there, there is, however, a limit. Every country of the world will not be a member of NATO. It's a simplistic point, but it leads to the next step, simply being that some gray zones, some periphery is unavoidable. And that is a challenge that we need to be able to deal with. There is very interesting thinking going on now on a new architecture. I tried to spend some time on that, but I must admit, in the midst of what is going on, I think our primary concern is to make sure that we do what we can for the Ukrainians to succeed, while spending absolutely some time and attention on those questions. But for the time being, it's more of a first things first, and gradually that will come on the agenda as well.
Benedetta?
Well, yeah, no, and I would say the two questions are, of course, related, because I would agree with the premise of the question, meaning the European security order as the Helsinki European security order, so to speak, is either on dead support or deceased. So that's clear. And we'll have to find, in the longer term, a new European security order. So that I agree with. But of course, there is a clear, to me at least, and straight connection between what happens in Ukraine today and how the war ends and the future of the European security order. The two questions are related. A situation in which you have a stable, peaceful, sovereign, independent Ukraine gives us one path forward for a European security order that is also stable, peaceful, and where we can try to have rekindle those shared principles. A different path, a different outcome in the war in Ukraine completely changes the game. So supporting Ukraine today and ensuring that we get that outcome, to me, is essential to make sure that then we can return to having a European security order that is stable, peaceful, and predictable. If I may steal one more minute, I also want to take the question on, because it's the question of whether talking about hybrid, energy, climate, if this is about overreaching. I think it's a very important question, and we thought about it a lot in the process of negotiating the strategic concept. And the reality is that the world is complex. And that means that once upon a time, it was much easier to put clear boundaries and say, this is a military matter, this is purely civilian and doesn't concern us. That's great, but that's not how it works today. Think of resilience. Is it possible for us to deter and defend credibly if our physical infrastructure isn't fit for purpose? If our bridges cannot sustain our tanks, if our 5G is not secure, if a satellite communication is not safe and secure and accessible. So there are interlinkages that we simply cannot ignore. And that's the point of made in the strategic concept. Not that NATO needs to take care of, be the first responder on everything, but that ultimately we are as strong as our societies, and that there is a deep link between having strong, resilient societies and having strong, effective deterrence and defense posture. So we need to deal with that issue as a transatlantic community. Many of the answers will be national, others will be through the EU, and that's one of the areas why NATO-EU cooperation is so crucial. But certainly the notion that we can think about credible and effective deterrence and defense without thinking about resilience, it simply doesn't withstand the test of reality in this interconnected world. And then a lot of the threats and challenges we face are hybrid. Look at the energy crisis we're facing today. That's weaponization of our energy supply. And clearly that's something that we need to discuss also through a security lens. So I don't think we're overreaching. I think we're actually going back to our core mission. Only things that matter to defend and deter and ensure the defense of allies.
Thank you, Benedetta. Baiba, do you want to say anything on this?
On the big challenges for the future, very clear, again, the allies, the 30 allies, soon to be 32 allies, are united around that. It's the digital transformation, meaning how do you use the most hedge? How do you predict the abilities, the capabilities that you need to fight the future warfare? We see elements of that warfare currently in Ukraine, how the big data, how the private sector is used for enabling the defense, but also the authoritarian actors, how they are able to use their links in providing some capabilities that, again, we have to find the answers, and where the Ukrainians have to be able to figure out how to defend, changing so fast, in such a fast-paced defense environment. So it's a big challenge, I think, for everyone. And then, of course, what Benedetta touched upon, what we have on the economic side also, the question is the role of the private sector and the civil society at large, for enabling the civil military preparedness. How do we all become part of that security of the future for our states, where it's not only military, but where civilian part, the private sector, plays such an important role. So the future exercises, currently we have the big exercises that exercise across all domains, the sea and the air and the space and cyber and everything. Furthermore, we need to do even wider type of exercises involving the private sector, involving the various angles, and quickly learning the lessons and making sure that it's really they are implemented and it works, and we are able to respond. So there is a whole set of we not only have the deterrence and defense in Euro-Atlantic area concept, which provides for the ability currently to adopt in the next few years, but actually we have the future warfighting concept also right there, and that provides for adaptation to 2040. But it's this agile defense, agile development, the ability to respond on the go. And for that, I think every member of our society has to be just ready to understand that they play a role in all of this. And we cannot have private sector saying that, oh, it's government's responsibility. No, it's not. It's all our responsibility.
Thank you, Baiba. We've got 20 minutes left. I come from the Yorkshire School of brutal panel chairing, so I'm going to be fairly direct about this. We have 4 more questions. I've closed the floor to questions now to give my team a chance to respond. Let's take the 4 questions in sequence here, and you can respond to whoever wishes to respond to whichever question. Sir, who are you and what is your question?
Thank you very much. I'm Nicholas Hatiashvili, representing Parliament of Georgia and Future Leaders Program of Riga Conference. Amid the Russian aggression and war in Ukraine, we see that it's impacted the whole international security architecture. We see that European Union tries to decrease its dependence on Russian energy resources and looking for alternative supply chains. So one of the alternative ways lies on Georgia to bring Caspian.
What is your question, sir?
So my question is, will this environment accelerate the accession of Georgia to the NATO?
Thank you.
Very simple.
Second question.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Captain Wolf. I work for the commander of Multinational Corps Northeast, who is responsible for the defense of the Baltics and northeastern Poland. I have 2 questions actually. The first one is, do you think history is repeating itself? And by that I mean, if I look at it as a German view, the appeasement policy by Wandel durch Handel has failed, just as Chamberlain's appeasement policy has failed against Hitler. I believe we are in a proxy war right now within Europe, just like the Korean War. And last but not least, I think we're again in state power competition. So does that mean we will go to another General Defense Plan 2.0 with standing forces close to the border? And do you think, is that realistic? And secondly, can we trust NATO to fulfill the Madrid summit? And do you think it is realistic? Thank you very much.
Sir, I wrote my Oxford thesis on British policy in the coming of war. It was definitely more complicated than that. We had the biggest rearmament program in our history from February 1934, but I shall lecture you later about that. Madam.
Thank you. I'm Dorothy Zsiboraj, final year student at War Studies Department, King's College London. So my question is about the contested narratives about the future of international order between authoritarian and democratic states. So the question is, how can NATO strengthen its narrative about the success of rules-based international order, and what are the tools to counter disinformation by preserving democratic values? Thank you.
Very, very good. I used to teach at King's College War Studies Department. Good person.
Thank you. My name is Artem Surshulskis. I'm representing U.S. Embassy here in Riga. And my question goes mainly to Baiba Braže. We've heard a lot about very important global challenges to NATO and our approach towards them. What I didn't hear today much is our local challenges. And what I mean by that, we have several regions within the NATO which are, by different reasons, very vulnerable. Such as, for example, Latgal region here on the border with Russia, which is because of economic, historical ties and vulnerability to propaganda from Russia, it's quite challenging. And my question is whether NATO has any good tools, good strategies, something that NATO can do actually to strengthen these kind of regions. Of course, I'm not talking only about our region. We have several more, but I suppose in the X hour, this is very important that we are firstly united inside. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have Georgia's accession to NATO. Who wants to take that? Good man.
Speaking on behalf of the, well, just one of the 30, soon to be 32, I'm happy to say that my government supports the Euro-Atlantic ambitions of Georgia, but let me be straightforward and say that that path also comes with commitments and responsibilities for reform, and I'm unfortunately not an expert on the status of defense and governance reforms in Georgia, but my understanding is that some progress needs to be desired to actually be able to move forward. So while the support for the ambition stand, it comes with responsibilities to actually make progress on your own side as well.
Next question.
Can I just
Please
add a little
do,
bit?
Barbara, yeah.
Quite clearly, again, as NATO at 30 and soon to be 32, we are very committed to our partnerships, and it's very clear that those partnerships are individual. We saw that Finland and Sweden actually are ready to make that jump. They are not only now politically ready and applied for membership, but they've been a partner for many, many years, as long as NATO has been actually in place. And have worked with NATO on everything. They have strong democratic institutions, they have full interoperability, they have full political commitment. So the partnerships are very different. In the same time, we have partners who are in MENA region and Middle East, North Africa, totally different type of arrangement, who have chosen certain type of defense capacity building, like Jordan. We have partners now in Indo-Pacific, the 4 partners, who actually work very closely with us on hybrid threats, be it cyber, be it countering disinformation, and quite a number of others. So each partnership, it depends what the partner wants, how far it wants to use NATO's expertise, and it depends, of course, on what NATO also sees as appropriate. As for the membership in NATO, as the State Secretary said, the Bucharest language stands on Ukraine and Georgia. The Article 10 of the Washington Treaty says that it's a country that contributes to the Euro-Atlantic security, it's a European country, and it needs consensus of all allies to be accepted to the alliance. So it's very straightforward, and as far as Georgia is concerned, it's very much also in Georgian own hands. Georgia needs to demonstrate all those capabilities, needs to be fully committed to Euro-Atlantic integration and just work towards it, and then one day the Bucharest language will come through. So it's pretty straightforward, but in the same time very complicated. And then also I will use the opportunity to answer the question very shortly on the contested narratives.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Benedetta will want to join on countering disinformation on that. Again, the rules-based international order is something that countries have agreed to. Nobody has pushed them. The parliaments have ratified. UN Charter is a document that has been ratified by the parliaments in those countries, by their legislative authorities, whatever ways they function. Are they democracies? Are they full democracies, part democracies, contested autocracies, a little bit autocracies, or autocracies such as not fully democratic or not aggressive, and so on and so forth. What is important in this case is, of course, we clearly see that there are a number of actors that are hostile, and as far as NATO is concerned, to NATO allies, that are hostile in their actions against NATO allies, be it in cyber, be it in disinformation, be it elsewhere. And we clearly see actors that are violating that international rules-based order with kinetic force and with everything else. So if we as allies don't stand up, if we don't have the wider international community united, it's going to be very difficult to maintain those international principles that have managed to contain conflict, to prevent what we had in the Second World War, meaning that there are countries fighting wars on the territory, whether in Europe or elsewhere. So it's very clear that those principles have to be maintained, and we all have an interest, be it full democracies, partial autocracies, and so on and so forth. And that's why you have seen the international debate and those nuances in the UN, with 143 countries now standing up for Ukrainian territorial integrity, where all the allies, all the EU countries, and many others worked very hard to get that document adopted. And I think, again, we have to be very clear. That's why Ukraine is defending itself. It's a UN Charter approved right. And those that question the neutrality or others, those principles have been superseded by the UN Charter that clearly provides for non-aggression, territorial integrity, and so on and so forth.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to give you, Benedetta, you're going to have something to comment on the narrative issues. I'm going to leave the question about appeasement and can we trust NATO as the opening of your closing remarks in a minute.
So because I want
we'll just pause on that for a second. But this issue of regional security, how does NATO strengthen regional security in supporting nations in those regions? Do you want to have a bash at that, or Eivind? We only have 9 minutes left.
No, on the regional security, let me use Swedish and Finnish soon-to-be accession to NATO as an example, because at least in our debate back home, you can hear people being worried about NATO's land border with Russia being doubled with Finland's 1,300 kilometers new border. And that sort of contributes to potential risk and instability. I wholeheartedly disagree. What this year's events in Ukraine has shown us is that having countries sort of with a, pardon the expression, and a NATO light membership, sort of being connected but not full NATO members, having gray zones, lack of clarity, that leads to instability. Now having Finland and Sweden clearly on the inside under Article 5, that leads to predictability and stability in our region, including, of course, for Latvia and the wider Baltic region, and the sea just not far from here will soon be de facto almost a NATO lake.
Thank you,
which is a good thing as well.
That's great. Right, I'm now going to enter into closing remarks.
Okay.
And I'm going to start with Benedetta,
all right,
who's bursting to attack the appeasement and can we trust NATO question. So,
sure.
Benedetta.
Right. Can we trust NATO? That's a good question. But the question, if I'm not mistaken, is can we trust NATO to deliver on the commitments agreed in Madrid, so more specific, and in terms of the military and political adaptation. Let me turn it around. The question, can we trust NATO, is really, can we trust ourselves? NATO is but 30, soon to be 32 countries. We have come to, all decisions are made, as you know, by consensus. It is not a supranational organization. We have 30 sovereign nations at the table. They have come together. They have assessed together the security security environment. They have seen that today our peace and security cannot be taken for granted, that we face the gravest security crisis since the end of the Cold War, that the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace, and that we face a decade of upcoming strategic competition, pervasive instability, and recurring shocks. They have agreed all this, and that they have said, well, there's only one recipe here, and that is we gotta spend more. We gotta spend on our defense. We gotta invest in our defense. We got to modernize our armed forces. We got to think more about resilience. We got to embed security conversations and security considerations into how we do our economic policies. We need to think about our critical assets, infrastructure, technologies, also through a national security lens. They have committed to this because they believe that this is what's required in this historic phase of the alliance. I believe that that was the right decision. I think the signs that we have seen, especially since February, is that there is a change. I think Russia did not expect our resolve to be as steadfast, did not expect us to step up as quickly as we did. We need to keep this up, both in the support for Ukraine and in our own military modernization. But the question ultimately is, I believe we can and we will, because we have no alternative, meaning what is the alternative? Can we not, I know that we talk in terms of affordability and budgets, and that's really important, but we also need to see affordability ultimately is a political question. You can afford based on your risk and trade-off, risk and benefits, and risk calculation. In this particular case, if we really believe what we have said about the security environment, then we cannot afford not to spend in defense. It's simply not an add-on, it's a must. And that requires, I'm close, I have maybe 20, 30 seconds, so I think I'll do good by you. That requires the most important change that we need, and I think that's what we're going through, is a change of mindset. And that's something that I would say actually a lot more in Western European capital than here, but the point is we need to simply wise up to the fact that we're not in Kansas anymore. So we just cannot afford to have others take care of our security. We have to do it ourselves. And on appeasement, in 10 seconds, I'm not a war historian, but I have kids. And as a mom, I would tell my kids, you know what, if you encounter a bully, whatever you do, don't give in. Yeah. It's not going to work. If you don't stand up to a bully, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. I think that principle applies. I think we could think about it a little bit more, and if we had, perhaps things might have been slightly different, but what do I know? But that's what I would tell my kids.
Thank you, Benedetta. You both have a minute each, because I have something brilliant to say at the end. Eivind.
Question here was whether history is repeating itself. I can't remember who actually said this originally, but history does not repeat, but it rhymes from time to time. Let me just, in closing, echo the last sentiments that now viewed in the rearview mirror, Putin's Russia, what happened in Ukraine in 14, what happened in Georgia in 08. It's just so abundantly clear that the appeasement road would just lead them to take the next step and the next step. And that's why it's so essential that collectively and individually, as NATO allies, we continue to support Ukraine to make sure that it stops here.
Thank you, Eivind. Very disciplined. Baiba.
On trust in NATO, I will just use data to say that we poll our audiences at NATO every year several times, and the trust in NATO has never been higher than it is now. So not quite the Norwegian level of 98%, you said?
96 only. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. But overall, it's well above 80% generally across the countries in NATO. So there is trust of our publics, also trust to be responsible with regard to nuclear deterrence, increased support for defense spending or maintaining. So there's a full package of trust that we can see. In the same time, obviously, for a question such as whether NATO will do something for Latgale or whether there are quick fixes, The point is that I don't represent Latvia here, I represent NATO. So we look at the whole area of responsibility of NATO's area of responsibility together. And in that respect, of course, NATO has indications and wordings about all types of situations, all types of issues across the border of NATO at 360, that includes also the south, and secure our military leaders, our civilian leaders, our intel, make sure that those indications or warnings are as sharp as ever, that they are taken into account, that we know what's going on, and that we are ready to respond for any scenario. As for the internal situation in Latvia, I'm sure there are politicians you can ask, and NATO doesn't deal with internal politics of its allied member states, and you won't hear NATO officials criticizing our allies. With that, we are NATO. We are stronger together.
We are NATO. Indeed, we are indeed NATO. And let me conclude this excellent panel. I thank you, all three of you, for superb insights. I think the most important thing about the strategic concept, and in many ways it's a wish list, but it indicates a mindset change on the parts of our heads of state and government. And there can be no going back on that strategic concept, because the next 10 to 15, 20 years are going to be extremely challenging. We have a decade of risk ahead of us, which NATO is the great stabilizer. But make no mistake, Europeans, the United States is fully committed to the alliance. But the United States is busy, and it's going to be very busy worldwide. And at the very least, the United States has the right to expect that the burdens will be shared equitably. And that means that we Europeans collectively do more for our own defence in and around Europe. That's the implicit contract that's at the heart of the strategic concept. And if you merge the strategic concept with the military strategy, that means a European future force, from seabed to space, across air, sea, land, cyber, information and knowledge, which is credible as a high-end first responder in an emergency, because our adversaries will not offer us single-packaged crises. There'll be simultaneous crises the world over designed to complicate America's life. And that's why what heartened me about the strategic concept and the military strategy was it was the beginning of a return to the worst-case planning that was the heart of the 1967 strategic concept of NATO, which I regard as being the most grounded in its attempt to balance strategy, capability, and affordability. And one final word on European strategic autonomy. European strategic autonomy, or responsibility as I like to call it, it's about bloody time. But autonomy is a function of power, not words. The more capability we Europeans generate, the more capacity for responsibility and autonomy we will have. The age of words, it's over. The age of delivery has just begun. Panel, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.